So let me start by introducing my good friend Jeff Leach. As many of you know, he served as the House chair of the House Committee on Judiciary, Civil Issues last session and did a terrific job. This is his fourth term in the state legislature, and he's been not only an advocate on criminal justice reform, but also on lowering property taxes, on protecting children in our child welfare system, and addressing issues of sexual assault on college campuses. He graduated from Baylor University, which of course has been in the news recently. And also a law degree from SMU, and he's been named a rising star by a super lawyer by Texas Lawyer Magazine. But perhaps most importantly, he is co-chair of the new Criminal Justice Reform Caucus in the House that was formed just this interim. So we're really excited about that. Chairman Leach, I'd like to just invite you to give some remarks, and then I'll introduce Chair Collier.
Sure. Is this on? Yeah. Check. There you go. Can you hear me? Well, good morning to everyone. Mark, thank you for the kind introduction, and it's always great to be with my colleague and classmate, Madam Chair Collier. It's great to see you, and look forward to seeing Chairman White as well. And I want to apologize in advance. I do have to leave around 11:30 to in a hurry to catch a flight to D.C. Why anyone would be in a hurry to get to Washington, D.C. is a little bit crazy. But appreciate your understanding, and it's great to be here. This subject is a really important one. It's an interesting one. It's a timely one, just criminal justice reform generally. Of course, the successes we've seen in Washington over the past couple years were predicated a lot on what Texas has already done, Mark, as you appropriately and correctly pointed out. The thing that excites me most about this issue is I think it's one of the few nationwide, and certainly here in Texas, it's one of the few issues on which there seems to be real, substantive, genuine, bipartisan coalitions supporting this issue. We, of course, not in Texas as much as in Washington or other states, we, of course, have our partisan fights and disagreements and debates, and those will always take place. But criminal justice reform, there's different ideas, different challenges, different opportunities, different scenarios, Mark, that we're going to consider, talk about today. But really what you're seeing, I think, not only among legislators, but in the public as well, as I go out and talk to folks in our district, whether it's law enforcement or citizens at the doorstep, chambers of commerce, Republican clubs, NAACP, when I talk to these folks, criminal justice reform is a top issue for a lot of them. And that you wouldn't have heard that 10 years ago. That's a great thing, and we've got an opportunity to take advantage of that momentum and to make some great strides here to protect our principles, to advance the cause of freedom, yes, to keep those who need to be locked away, but also to create avenues of freedom and restoration for those who can be revived. And most people, the vast majority of people, can be and should be revived and restored, and the Texas legislature is going to support them in that effort. So it's great to be here, Mark. Thank you.
Now let me turn to Chair Collier, and then, of course, we'll have some questions from me and our audience as well, and we'll also, of course, have some remarks by Chairman White when he arrives. But Chair Collier was the first woman to represent House District 95 in Tarrant County, and she's also in her fourth term of office as well. And she was, as all of you know, designated to chair the House Criminal Jurisprudence Committee. And for those of you who've ever been before that committee, like I have, you may know it is probably one of the most, I think it is the busiest committee, over 300 bills typically per session, hearings late into the night, whether it's 2 or 3 in the morning that I and others have testified. And she did a marvelous job last session in that role. She was reelected in 2018 by the Texas Legislative Black Caucus as their first vice chair. And she's been a leader on so many issues, whether it's healthcare, consumer protection, small business, and so forth. So we're really delighted to welcome Chair Nicole Collier. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for having me here, and thank you so much for welcoming here. I appreciate you having me here, and I'm in unfamiliar territory. I will admit that. It's kind of awkward. I'm the most liberal member of the Texas legislature, and I'm in an area with you guys in the most conservative area. But it's funny because we come back together on criminal justice reform issues. I was a little skeptical when Mark came in to my office in the beginning. Him and Derek came into my office at the beginning of the legislature, and I was like, let's see what they got to say about criminal justice reform. And I was like, I was like, oh my gosh, we agree. We agree. And we may not agree on the reasons why, but we get to the same point. We get to the same end goal. And so for that, I am so grateful. In fact, they taught me a lot. They educated me a lot. I'm an attorney by trade, but I don't practice criminal law. But Mark and Derek were very helpful in helping me understand a lot of the issues that were impacting the criminal justice system. In fact, we worked on quite a few bills together, so I'm grateful for the work that TPPF has done in that arena. I mean, they have advanced Texas so much in criminal justice. In fact, they've taken the nation further. So they are way ahead of a lot of states and have helped the federal government get further. So I'm grateful for that, and I'm looking forward to working with TPPF. Can you believe that? I said that. In terms of criminal justice reform, let me caveat, in terms of criminal justice reform. So I'm grateful for your work that you are doing in that, and it is a bipartisan effort in terms of advancing criminal justice reform. And there's still more work that we can do together to make sure, and like Chairman Leach was saying, it touches all areas. It's a circle, full circle. Criminal justice, it impacts all areas of life. It impacts education, and it impacts our it impacts businesses, it impacts the home. So if we can tackle this criminal justice issue, we can have more productive citizens in our communities and and it can boost our economy. So let's get to work on improving the criminal justice system.
So I was going to ask you all about some specific issues, and one of them, of course, we'll talk about. I'll wait till James gets here to bring up the Sandra Bland bill, because he was so involved in that too. But that was obviously the most high-profile issue, partly because of how many times it kept coming up last session. But let me ask you just about some of the other issues that I think all of us are concerned about, and one of them being, and the panel that Derek moderated covered this a little, but because there's been this federal litigation during the interim relating to bail issues, both in Harris County, Galveston County, Dallas County, what do you see as the prospects? And especially since you, Chair Collier, you introduced an amendment when the House bill was on the floor that actually really improved that bill by cutting out something that had been added that basically said people could only be released on commercial bail. And so it ended up, being modest, but a step in the right direction, and unfortunately there wasn't time to consider it in the Senate. But what do you see as the prospects on that for next session?
Well, the lobby is strong. The bail lobby is strong. The problem is the money issue. People, if you don't have money, you can't get out of jail. And so the money bail system is what is hindering people. So it's determined on wealth. And so if you're wealthy, you can get out of jail. If you're not, you cannot. And so the people who stay in jail lose their jobs. And so then it puts them into this vicious cycle of debt. Then they lose their homes, and then they go out and rob again. I mean, it just puts them into a vicious cycle. So if we can get people back to work and back to being productive, then they won't be in these situations again. Hopefully they won't be in these situations. And into services, we have to have services available for them if they're addicted to, drugs or something, or whatever their issue is. So the problem with the bail system is trying to have options. We have to give the magistrates or the judges all options for these individuals. And so the pretrial risk assessment tool is something that we need to look at. But the one thing I want to make sure is that it is validated. The tool must be a validated tool. It must not have a disparate outcome. The outcome cannot be discriminatory. And that was one of my concerns with the pretrial risk assessment tool. But we have to have one, because we can't have a bail system where certain individuals are getting out in one area, and it's just, it's different in every county. It has to be something that's across the board, and it's being used, and it's a validated process. And we had one in place, and it was available, and it could have been used, but it just fell apart at the end. So that's what I saw.
Yeah, I agree. And just to pull back the curtain a little bit, if you'll allow me to, in terms of the legislature and the legislative session, Mark, you mentioned in your remarks here, your question, that time ran out on the Senate side. And, I've been in the House for 4 terms now, and I've learned that time never runs out on your priorities. I have seen bills that are deader than a doornail on the last weekend before session, before sine die, come back to life because there was a will, and usually that will is at the top. And so what we need to do, what I would say, the reason that bill died is because there wasn't the will to pass it. There needs to be in the Senate.
In the Senate.
That's right. And I'm not placing blame at any one person's feet individually. You're smart enough. You can determine who that might be. But the reality is we've got to be working now, not next January when session convenes, to build the support we need, not necessarily in the pink building across the street, but among Texans, to talk about what the issue is, to help educate people, to hear from Texans, to tell the story. Criminal justice reform is such a great issue because this is about real lives, real people. Real dark stories sometimes and real awesome stories that we should be telling statewide to compel our state's leaders to make it a priority. And that's really one of the issues, one of the main priorities for the Criminal Justice Caucus that we've created in the House. Bipartisan caucus. You've got Nicole Collier on the caucus. I didn't know you were the most liberal member, by the way.
Well, it might be. Not now. Not now.
Yeah, not now.
I've lost that.
And you got Nicole Collier and you've got Briscoe Cain. You've got Jeff Leach and Synfronia Thompson and James White and Joe Moody.
I believe you said my name with Briscoe Cain.
You've got, well, you said you're the most liberal. I heard him, profess this week he was the most conservative. Okay. So you got this great group of diverse individuals from all across the state, suburbs, urban. You've got rural. You've got a great diverse group of talent and experience. And that the main purpose, Mark, for that caucus is for us to, in a sense, try to be the clearinghouse, the gateway, if you will, to the most pressing criminal justice issues that we feel the legislature can and should unite behind to pass next session. We could sit here all day and talk about dozens and dozens of important criminal justice issues, which probably we should make progress on. But what we want to try to do is to identify those 3 to 5 issues that we can unite on and that we can really push together on. So I'm not just pushing with my one finger and you're pushing with your pinky. We've got a fist and we're pushing together on these issues in the Capitol, and bail reform is one of those issues.
Yeah, and it passed the Senate in 2017. So I think that there's no reason why it can't advance this time. And obviously there was some back and forth on some of the details, the nitty gritty of it. But you're absolutely right what you said about people in jail who can't afford bail, who aren't a danger. And the flip side of that, which Derek mentioned yesterday, is you've got people in jail, people released from jail just because they have money, who are a huge danger to the public. And there was actually a case, a guy who was charged with he already had several prior serious sex offenses against children, but while he was being held on a pretty high bail amount in Texas, his mother won the lottery, Texas lottery. I don't kid you. And she then was able to post. So this is how random the current system is. It's both, as Chief Justice Heck said, over-inclusive and under-inclusive. So I do hope we can address that next session. So what are some of the other issues, Chairman Leach, you think that the caucus is going to focus on besides that?
Well, and just one more comment on bail reform as well. I know there's some differing opinions among, we've talked about the bail guys and a lot of really good guys on that side who are experienced and have good ideas, and we invite them to the table. The Criminal Justice Reform Caucus, and I think all the legislatures that I know of that we've worked with, Nicole, on this issue, invite all of the stakeholders to join us for this discussion, where folks are going to get into trouble when we're going to have problems if they say no reform, no way, no how. Civil asset forfeiture is another issue. Come to the table, talk to us. We want to hear from our sheriffs, from our law enforcement, from the bail guys, and work on these issues together. That's how we're going to make the most progress. In terms of other issues, I'll just lay it out there. I mentioned civil asset forfeiture, bail reform. I think we need to continue to work on over-criminalization in Texas. We have I don't know the latest numbers, but the last numbers I heard were in Texas, we have over 1,700 criminal laws in the state of Texas, so 1,700 separate crimes. Over 1,500 of those, correct me if I'm wrong, over 1,500 of those 1,700 are found outside of the penal code. So they're in various state codes, the tax code, the business code, the agriculture code, whatever it may be. We've tried to solve problems by creating crimes. That's never a good idea. It's not a good thing that Madam Chair Collier's Criminal Jurisprudence Committee has the most bills of any committee, more than public education, more than Ways and Means, more than Health and Human Services. Why? Because legislatures have gotten really good at creating new crimes, and you've gotten really good at killing some. I was on the caucus for 2 sessions, and we found that to be the case very quickly. And then I'll just mention this. I think we've got work to do on death penalty reform. This is an issue as a conservative that I have admittedly grown into and learned a lot about after having been to death row myself and learned of the stories of some men who I believe very strongly should not be there. It should trouble every Texan, whether you're in support of the death penalty or not. It should trouble every Texan, and I believe rattle the collective conscience of our state that we've got innocent men on death row.
Absolutely.
And it keeps me up at night. There's not a lot, but there are some. Jeff Wood is one who I don't believe should be there. Jeff Wood is not innocent of a crime, but he's not innocent of a crime deserving the state to put him to death. Rodney Reed is another one. So, and that's another issue that I think you're seeing great, very positive bipartisan movement on. And I don't think we should be afraid to tackle that issue next legislative session.
Well, I was just going to add, well, we didn't get as many bills this session as public ed. Public education did get the most bills this time. Yeah, so, but I would agree. But there's other issues that we need to address. Definitely with the, so Ms. T. Sinfrodia Thompson did have a death penalty bill that we should have passed this session that came down from, it was a court case that dealt with individuals with intellectual disabilities and whether they could stand trial, they could be held for the death, for death. And so that bill did not pass this session. So that was something that we should have fixed in our law because there was a court case that dealt with that. And so these are issues that we need to address next session. Other issues that we need to address, deal with, and that didn't get passed in the Senate, deal with people who are Class C, whether you can be arrested for a Class C misdemeanor. We call it cite and release, or arrest for Class C misdemeanors that are nonviolent. Also, decriminalization of marijuana, possession of less than an ounce, of marijuana. That was a bill. The governor was even ready to sign that bill, but it didn't get anywhere in the Senate. In fact, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick said that the bill is dead on arrival. And in fact, he kept his promise, and the bill went nowhere. So it passed in the House, and the bill died in the Senate. So we could have had that bill taken care of. So now we've got some issues with that when we passed the hemp bill. You guys have heard about what happened with the hemp. The farmers can grow hemp as long as it has 3% of THC. And so the problem with that is that you can't distinguish between hemp and marijuana unless you test it. And so now the DAs are having problems determining between hemp and marijuana unless you test it. Well, if you have hemp and if you have marijuana, the only way they can tell you is if they test it, but there's not too many labs in Texas that will be able to distinguish between the two. And so you have differences between municipalities or areas that say, well, we're just going to do a ticket. We're just going to give them a ticket if it's an ounce or less of marijuana. We're just going to give them a ticket and release them. So it's called a cite and release policy. I think even Austin here is going to vote on that coming up. And DPS has said that they're going to do cite and release after their fiasco. They're going to do a cite and release policy. And so, but then others are saying, we're going to test everything. So, and it's just different across. So what I'm going to do this interim is I'm going to be touring different counties across the state to find out, what is your policy? What are you going to do? Because we need to look at this across Texas and study this and see what we need to do in the law, because it's going to be different everywhere, and we're going to have different outcomes for individuals who are, coming to our great state. And then people are going to be jailed for different reasons. It's going to be discriminatory in different areas. So that's something that I'm going to be looking at. So the cite and release policies of different counties and wherever you are, I'm going to be looking at that. I'm going to be looking at the arrest. I want to see about this. I want to bring that back up. The arrest policy. Why should the Sandra Bland, more of the Sandra Bland? Why are you arresting somebody on a ticket for a traffic stop? Why should we do that? So let's bring that back up. That's a bill that I want us to talk about again.
Get up here, Chairman White.
Yeah,
great.
speaking of that bill, that was his bill.
Yeah. Well, we were going to wait for you to talk about it. It's perfect timing.
That is
we're not-
perfect timing.
we're not- since you spent
Yeah.
so much time on it last session, I don't feel like
Perfect
we're
timing.
putting you on the spot at all. But I
Yeah.
also want to.
We were just talking about you.
You were just talking about you.
Well, I could go read my introduction to you, but I think everyone here knows you and knows how much you've done on this issue over the years, and also the fact that you're one of the top conservative leaders overall in the legislature. So, thank you for joining us, and sorry on the mix-up on the time. So.
Good to see you. 3 days in a row.
So yeah, we were just talking about the Sandra Bland bill, which you spent a lot of time on the floor working on.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen next session?
Sometimes,
Yeah, what are we gonna do?
it's a big deal, but the outcome, 8,000 pieces of legislation that are filed every session, and maybe 1,000 make it across the finish line. Obviously that wasn't one that made it. I think the biggest issue of this is the conjecture behind it. Not to be overly political, but I think there's a certain candidate running in a certain party primary, and try to equate that to allowing people to do all types of stuff, defecate and whatnot, outside of people's businesses. And that bill just didn't have anything to do with that. Actually, that bill would have allowed folks like that to get rounded up and arrested. So it's just a lot of conjecture. It's a lot of the stuff in criminal justice. And I think both sides do it, right? It's a lot of conjecture. It's a lot of it's probably something new. But this is what we know. We're still winning on the issue, Mark, because so many law enforcement agencies across the state have policies now addressing this. So we're still winning the issue. And obviously no one, you heard about what happened up in Kentucky. Some state senator filed a bill to say that, police could come up and ask you and make you you have to prove to the police officer that you didn't commit a crime. And if the police officer still didn't agree with that he could round you up and detain you for 2 hours. So,
Or he could detain you if he felt like you were about to commit a crime.
yeah, about to commit a crime. Yeah. So minority report type stuff, right? So we're winning the issue, and we'll see how it works by next session. But we're winning the issue so greatly, we may not even need to do anything. The municipalities and the local people will probably be very, very far ahead of us.
Yeah, and that I think is an important point because a lot of rank and file police officers agree with us. Our head of our policing program, Randy Peterson, is here, wrote a great paper pointing out how, yes, there's one union that decided that they wouldn't even talk to legislators about this bill. But, there's a lot of rank and file officers who don't want to arrest people for failure to signal, for a broken taillight. And that's what we were talking about, traffic violations, and where there's not a breach of the peace. And that's what the bill said, that people shouldn't be arrested like Sandra Bland was for that. And I know we've seen polling. I don't remember if we did it or another organization. I mean, literally 85 or 90% of Texans, including Republicans, have that perspective that no, we shouldn't be dragged to jail for a traffic violation if nothing else is going on, if there's no breach of the peace. So it's so commonsensical, one does wonder why we even have to do it. But there are several thousand arrests every year for nothing but a traffic violation.
And Mark, another thing, when various, and we're not against any group. We appreciate the work that all of our labor organizations do. I think I've been endorsed by a labor organization, believe it or not. But saying that, when you go back and look, those of us that are supposed to be strong Second Amendment supporters, we'll find out that some of these groups in the past were very, very opposed to certain measures. Those of us that say that we're for strong borders, we're for strong immigration enforcement, some of these same groups apparently believe that it's okay to arrest you for a non-jailable fine, but they opposed things like such as holding a violent criminal on an ICE detainer. So So when these folks come out with this conjecture and this opposition, sometimes you got to drill deep and look at some of the other stuff they're opposed to, and a lot of it, and of course I love Nicole, she's a great person, but a lot of these people have opposed a lot of things, even in the Republican platform, and so we've got to understand that and really understand what being a constitutional conservative is really all about.
I'm not ready to let go of that bill.
Yeah, I know.
Well, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, which I thought was interesting, because Chairman Leach brought up two issues together: overcriminalization. As I always talk about 11 felonies relating to oysters that we have, things outside the penal code, and the issue of the law of the parties, which was in the Jeff Wood case where he, didn't have an intent to kill anyone. And they're actually related because most of these obscure criminal laws don't have a required mental state that you have to prove, or say that it's just strict criminal liability. And that is the same question of you should have to have, in most cases, some level of intent to be guilty of a crime. That's the old definition of a crime, was a bad act, actus reus, plus mens rea, a guilty mind. So how do we, I know last session the law of the parties bill, which I believe you had, it didn't quite get off the ground, but do you think that there's a chance to move that next session?
Yeah, I do. And the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus is going to be working on that. A number of other legislators, Representative Dutton, Representative Canales, filed bills on it. It's an important discussion for us to have. When I talk about there being innocent men on death row, Jeff Wood is the first one that comes to mind when he's there based on a crime that someone else committed. Again, he wasn't perfect and scotch-free in the commission of the robbery, but he did not know that the gentleman who went in to rob the store even had a gun on him. The required mental state, Mark, the mens rea, as you said, was not there. And I remember back in 2015 when our good friend Ruth Jones McClendon finally was able to pass her, it actually might have been 17, finally was able to pass her Timothy Cole exoneration bill, which was so proud to get to know her and work with her and help pass that bill. And of course that bill dealt a lot with prosecutorial misconduct and reviewing those cases. And I'll never forget that there was one legislator who came up to me on the House floor as I was assisting Ruth at the front mic, and he was so angry about the bill that we're creating this sort of super appellate court in this independent commission to review convictions and to possibly exonerate men and women who in many cases have spent decades behind bars for crimes they didn't commit. And he said, I'm voting against this. This is wrong. He said, I don't care if there's someone in prison for a crime because he didn't commit that crime, because I guarantee you he committed a bunch of other crimes. And he used the Jeff Wood case. Well, yeah, Jeff Wood didn't kill anyone or know anyone's going to be killed, but he was the getaway driver for what he thought was a robbery. Well, as an attorney, as a legislator, but also as a constitutional conservative, that is not right. That is not correct, and we shouldn't sleep well knowing that there's legislators, not many of them, who believe like that. So we got to pull back. We got to pull back the curtain. We got to pull up the rug, not just sweep under it a little bit. We got to roll it up and put it in the corner of the room and really look where there's some dirty inconsistencies in our criminal justice system, and be willing to have conversations about cleaning it up. So, and again, I want to come back to that's what the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus is all about.
Well, let us, I have some more questions, but more importantly, I'd like to, if none of you have any concluding thoughts right now, turn it over so the audience, and I know, Jeff, you might need to leave because it's 11:30. But thank you so much for your leadership on this. I'm sorry? Oh, okay, yeah, go ahead.
Well, he mentioned the law of parties. Yeah. We did have a bill in my committee in criminal jurisprudence about the law of parties, because in addition to Jeff Wood, Kenneth Foster Jr. is also, he was on death row, but now he's serving life in prison without parole for murder under the law of parties. So Chairman Dutton, Harold Dutton, filed a bill, and it was heard. I did give it a hearing in my committee, and I brought it up for a vote, but the bill failed. The bill failed to get affirmative vote in the Criminal Jurisprudence Committee because it didn't pass. And like you were saying, Mark, mens rea, I did go to law school, and I know mens rea means the mind. You have to have the mental state to commit the murder, commit the crime. Everybody has to agree. And so when you have murder, it means that you have to agree to commit that crime. And so we were all ingrained in law school. You have to have the mental state to do that. And if you're doing, to be convicted of murder, for something that you didn't pull the trigger on, it just blows us away to think that you are being convicted for that. And so Kenneth Foster Jr. But what the state doesn't do is when you are convicted for murder under the law of parties, we don't track that. We have no idea of how many people are in jail or in prison on death row under the law of parties. So it's just, so what I've asked, I've been trying to do is collect that data. How do I figure it out? Well, guess what? We may have to go through every jury charge, and even then we may not know because it may just say they were convicted of murder. So how do we find out how many people are in prison on death row or life without parole because their sentence has been commuted under the law of parties? So that's something that we need to figure out.
Well, it actually brings up a broader issue, which is better data to make decisions.
Exactly.
And actually, Chelsea, you helped pass in Florida the model data bill for the whole country on figuring out how many people are being sentenced to prison, how long are people serving for all these different crimes, and a whole lot of outcomes as well in terms of recidivism, employment, all the things we care about. And so Florida actually is a real leader in that area. And I know, James, that's something you've talked about looking at for this next session.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. They keep really doing the question mark thing.
Okay,
They're
right.
in the front row. I mean, like, we got to really take questions like right now.
Okay.
But all right. Well, let's open it up then. We've got a lot of, I see in the audience a lot of folks who know a lot about these issues because I've recognized many of them. So let's just flow it open here for questions.
The past session, your bill didn't pass. So I'm wondering why you couldn't pass that in February. Nothing happens in the February of next year. Legislation just goes around doing nothing, seems like. All the bills passed in the last 2 weeks. But if you have a bill almost ready, why can't you do that in February?
We have a moratorium on bills. We don't even get committee assignments until February. And so once you have your committee assignments, and then you can start hearing bills. So it's like we have a cooling off period as soon as we get to the session. And so we're not allowed to actually hear bills and pass bills until a certain time period. So they give us, I think it's like 120, how many days in before we can start actually taking action on bills?
I think it's 60 days.
60 days
Yeah, because
into-
all of January, February, and about a week week into March or so.
Yes.
Right.
So, I mean, it's like a cooling off period. They don't want us to rush in and just start voting things. And so the governor can give us emergency items where we can take action on right away. But other than that, we have a time period, a timeline of when we can actually take action on bills.
Well, and it brings up an important thing, because Chairman Leach talked earlier about the importance of working with different stakeholders because it's such a short session. And so, for example, on the probation reform legislation, I know Tara here with Alliance for Safety and Justice, that passed the House last session. Others, we sat down with probation chiefs and they were in agreement, and there were some changes made and all that, but it was an example of you're able to work those issues out during the interim or at the very beginning of session, because it's so easy to derail a bill for any group. And of course, we have the same offer to whether it's a police union. Shannon Edmonds from the DA Association was here yesterday. We work with Shannon all the time. He's a brilliant guy. So we do that work during the interim, and the same applies to obviously police groups. Randy was a police officer for 30 years and trained police officer, so I work with him every day. So we value that input, especially of people that are in law enforcement, given the sacrifice they make every day. So we want to sit down and say, how can we collaboratively come up with the best solution that not only looks good on paper, but will work in practice? And so I think that is even more important because of how short our sessions are.
And just think about, big bills that we had, bail reform. There were so many people that were involved in dealing with the bail reform. You had the bail industry, your group, TPPF. I know Doug Deason, he came in quite a bit to work on the bill. So many groups were coming in across Texas that you have to give them time to come in and, talk to the legislature about those bills. So.
Yep, and we'll work with them too. We'll work with anyone. Yep, go back here.
Thank you. This is Christopher Miller from Chris Miller Show, San Antonio, Texas. First of all, I want to thank the two chairpersons for coming, especially you, Chairman Collier, for coming to what some would think is the belly of the beast. But this is what we really need to focus on, is the fact that we do need to be building these bridges and bridging the gap between our two parties and get them back to the way that they have operated cleanly back in the day, I guess. My question is, so it's kind of a two-parter. What are we doing? They said there's a lot of people that were on death row that he said was innocent. I'm going to take that, I guess, at face value, but I would like to know what we're doing proactively to handle that. And second, I would like to know, why are we still bothering with marijuana? I mean, it's a huge waste of taxpayer money. Nobody cares about who smokes weed. It's got to be something that y'all think about when y'all in Congress. Like, why are we here? Like, why are we? I mean, it's one of those things where, do you ever feel like you want to just say, hey, let's put this behind us and deal with things that actually matter? Or
Congress, he's giving y'all a demotion.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, right. We get things done. Okay, so your first part dealt with capital cases, right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so you want to know
Why
what are
the
we
innocent?
doing with capital reform? So in the interim, we have an interim charge that deals with capital cases and evidence, dealing with capital evidence. So we want to look at, so right now with the Rodney Reed case, you know, they're going back and looking at the evidence in his case. You know, they're saying that somebody recanted the testimony and there's allegations that somebody has falsified testimony. So we want to look at, you know, how does somebody handle their appeal? And that's something that we're going to look at in capital cases. So these are such unique cases. Texas has, you know, some of the highest cases of capital. You know, people are tried for capital cases in Texas. So we want to look at that. We want to look at what is, you know, what required, what type of evidence would look at, you know, what type of evidence is for appeals. I want to look at those types of cases because we don't want anybody being put to death that is innocent.
Right.
You know, that's why Ruth McClendon worked so hard and tirelessly on that Timothy Cole Act. You know, she worked hard on that. And so we want to look at those types of issues. One thing I learned about yesterday, I come here to Austin to hear from stakeholders, is what we call them, about issues. I learned about something called future dangerousness. That's something that they look at when somebody's charged with a capital offense. They want to know if they're going to have a future dangerousness, not to us, but to the guards and other prisoners, and that's what they look at as to whether they should be put to death or on life without parole, or in life. And so, you know, those are issues. Like, why is future dangerousness an issue? Why is that even relevant to whether they should be put to death? You know, so, you know, these are issues that we need to look at as we're going through and going forward. So that's why. And in terms of marijuana, yes, I want to continue to look at that because people are being put in jail for something like that. That's not even something that I feel like is a jailable offense. That should be decriminalized, in my opinion.
I mean, you can grow it in your backyard, so it's like.
Well, I mean, we're going to have to, so I feel like we need to bring it up again.
Right.
It's
No, I'm
something
not
that we
growing
need
it,
to,
just so y'all know.
well, but what amazed me this session in the committee that I chair is how many times people wanted to increase penalties. There were so many bills that were filed that people wanted to make just about everything a first-degree felony. And I was like, why is this got to be a first-degree felony? That's life in prison. So I was just amazed at how many times people wanted to increase penalties. And so it's like, come on, let's think about this. Let's think about what you're trying to do. And so, you know, I would always bring the member in and say, okay, why are you trying to do this? Okay, it's heinous, okay. But what are the other options, you know?
Yeah, and they have to look at what these statutes actually say because some of them sound terrible, like a terroristic threat. Well, it's a child in school pushing the alarm bell, which is, of course, really bad in terms of what the consequences might be. But the child, you know, they're 10 or 12 years old. They're not really sure what they're doing. And then, of course, you know, there was one that we dealt with last session, abandoning an elderly person. And there was, you know, it basically was, okay, you know, grandpa and grandma get in a argument and he just drives off and leaves her at the gas station or something, and all of a sudden it's going to be, you know, first-degree felony or something. So, you know, the mens rea part's really critical. Obviously, are you, you know, abandoning someone with the intent to have harm to them, or, you know, is it that type of situation? So it's those. We did actually a little checklist several years ago that I wrote called "Look Askance Before You Enhance," and said, you know, here are the factors you should consider, and it doesn't mean you should never have enhancements, but you really ought to know what cases are being prosecuted now, how long are people serving, the kind of data we don't really have, and, you know, consider mens rea, of course. So those are important. And go ahead.
Right. Yes, and to the gentleman's question, I think he stepped out, but to the gentleman's question, I think you first start with the fundamental question, is the death penalty an appropriate form of punishment for certain offenses? I'm one to say yes, okay? And then if you move from there, obviously if you say no, you're getting to a different fact pattern, right? But if you say yes, then is how do we constitutionally and rightly do it, okay? And so we're going to have to continue, as the chairwoman said here, we're going to have to continue having very, very tough discussions with our district attorneys and other people who are involved in the appeals process. It's very, very disturbing, maybe embarrassing, but very, very disturbing. Someone like myself that doesn't have any formal legal training, when I read through these briefs, I read through these, what do you call them, habeas writs, lawyers sleeping during, the defense lawyer that is. Prosecutors never sleep, apparently. Lawyers sleeping during the trial, all types of holes in the evidence, all types of conjecture and evidence that shouldn't have been admitted, and then having still a pretty Republican-dominated conservative Supreme Court send these cases back down to us with their concerns. That should be a wake-up call. Understand that we can make mistakes sometimes. Now, on the issue of the marijuana thing, I think we got something out of the House. We're going to have to, get in the trenches and talk with our Senate members about this and come to some type of balance here. Obviously, we already have cite and release, so communities can sort of do some of this already right now. But look, we've got a lot of stakeholders. That word keeps coming up. So I'm listening to law enforcement officers. They're saying that, in some jurisdictions, I haven't seen the data. People say I have data, but I haven't seen the data. But they're saying in some of these other jurisdictions where there have been some type of lax bringing down the penalty or legalizing it, crime has increased. I don't know if that's a correlation or a causation, okay, but people just do these bivariate types of comparisons and say, well, on this date we legalized marijuana or we decriminalized it, and tomorrow we had 5 murders. Okay, I don't know what that means, okay, without some other clarifying variables. So we really need to dig into the data. But I'm just wondering, we have all these big discussions in the legislature about property taxes. And when you look at how some of these offenses really or really may not impact public safety, I'm just surprised why county judges, county commissioners, people that are, homeowners, it's really easy to grab me in the eateries in Kirbyville and Woodville and all these other places in my district talking about their property taxes, but we continue with these procedures that really don't on the margin do much for public safety, but they do have a public taxpayer impact. So I think we all need to go back home and try to get our folks back on the same sheet of music, and we can get something done next session.
Yeah, well, no, I'm glad you brought that up because and of course, those of us at TPPF are glad we cap local property tax increases, but they have to pay for indigent defense if somebody's charged with marijuana now because it's a jailable offense, and that comes out of the county taxpayers. Let me see, we have down here, okay.
Thank you. Dawn Freeman, Securus Foundation. So just from a corrections committee perspective, what are there any plans or things in the works from a reentry process or reintegration with TDC, so people who are transitioning back home?
Securus, thank you so much. Glad to see you here today. You're the phone people, right?
We're the foundation, but yes.
Oh, the foundation of the
Right.
phone people. Okay, and we were very, very glad that the TDCJ people were able to significantly reduce those phone rates of the foundation okay, phone rates for our folks that are in the units and trying to reconnect with their families. But to your question, reentry, reintegration, it's like blocking and tackling in football. I don't think you ever do it very, very good where you can just say we have mastered it. So I think next session we definitely, maybe even during the interim, we want to continue having discussions about transportation. Had a very good discussion yesterday in Hutchins. We had redistricting hearing. Obviously, we're not doing too much criminal justice on redistricting hearing, but sometimes it does come up. But myself and two other members, I believe it was Representative Sherman, Representative Bowers, we went to the Hutchins unit in South Dallas County, right? And we talked with some of our great reentry folks, the Takumi folks, and one thing they brought up was the idea of transportation. And they even did a project themselves where they modeled themselves as a parolee, having to navigate all of these hurdles and knowing what side of the street to stand on, to get the bus, to go to your parole office. And then think about this, if you're in a rural district, if you're in a rural part of Texas like I represent and where I live, you may not even have any type of public transportation. So, how these folks get around, I don't think I have Uber in Burkeville, in Newton, okay, Newton County. So how do you make sure that we are making the parole process valuable and not just another trap to get people caught up? So I think there's a lot more room in that space. Also, when we were at Hutchins, and I don't think the young man knew it was me, but we are sort of egotistical, and we like to see our names on bills. And specifically, I'm talking about House Bill 918. We've been around to see this bill actually in action, where folks are actually leaving the incarcerated setting with a resume. They're leaving with all of their important personal documents. Those of you that have been to the driver's license office and stand in line for 3 hours and find out that you don't have the right type of birth certificate, you know what I mean? Okay, now just imagine if you're coming out of prison and you get in that situation and you don't have any birth certificate at all. So the birth certificate, you go through mock job interview scenarios. So that was House Bill 918 that the Corrections Committee passed. I was the author on, and we got to see that in action. So it's all of that, but we have so much more that we need to work in that area.
Well, I'm glad you brought up transportation, and so there's a couple other issues relating to that, and I know earlier we talked about it. There were a raft of House criminal justice reform bills that didn't make it to the Senate. There was actually one Senate bill that didn't make it in the House, which would have pulled us out of the federal mandate for suspending driver's licenses for drug convictions, and I think there were about 22 or 23 votes on that in the Senate. I do think that one really did kind of run out of time in the House, but then there's also these hundreds of thousands of driver's license suspensions for people that can't pay this omni-base fee that's on, basically tickets.
And you see, we got to look at, let's go back to that. Sometimes you got to take a deep breath and look at that. So if I'm correct, you can commit murder and get paroled and, get out. Or you can do something almost as horrible. Sexually abuse a child. But your driver's license, I don't believe, is prohibited or inhibited for doing that. But we do that on and I think we had toned the bill down to.
Is that the vendor bill?
No, that's not the vendor bill.
Okay.
No, not that one. Not that one.
I don't like vendor bills.
I understand that. Well, you can say this is a vendor bill, but it's all a vendor bill. There's a lot of vendors involved in this criminal justice business. But so we got to really kind of take a deep breath, because when you're opposing stuff, when you're voting against stuff, you need to know what are you opposing and what are you voting against. So if you oppose that, you should have come to the floor with an amendment or another bill saying, I don't think anybody that does even a violent crime should be able to opt back in to have their driver's license. But obviously we don't want to do that, and that's not what was done. But you will single out someone for a possession case. So so technically, if I was running in a campaign against you, I would say you support and that's how we may need to start getting this stuff into campaigns and running against people. You support child molesters maintaining their driver's license while taking driver's license of people who are first-time drug possession people. If that's the commercial you want run in your district, hope we're not giving people any ideas. So we have to, you have to understand what you're voting on and what you are conveying to the people of Texas.
Yeah, and we did end the driver responsibility program. Senator Hall, thank you for your leadership on that. 1 million driver's license suspension. So there were a lot of good things, and like your House Bill 918, some people kind of tried to talk down the session on criminal justice, but there were a lot of positive things that came out of it.
Lots of positive things, and we were very, very glad that our Senate partners helped us out on that, on the women's dignity bill.
Human
we see a
trafficking.
Senate criminal justice staffer back there. He did a very, very good job in getting people need to do a little bit better, and we're working with him. He's a great guy.
Human
great
trafficking.
Guy.
We passed the
Yeah,
human
human
trafficking
trafficking, a whole lot of stuff. I mean, sexual assault, sex assault kits,
Yes.
getting those things tested,
Yes.
and rounding these folks up. So the Senate is very, very good, and they're going to be even better next session. We got to make sure the House stays good. Okay.
So down here.
Mike Lee.
Yeah,
Hey,
I know.
James,
I
what's
see
up?
the hat.
I had two questions. One is about cite and release. What can be done from a policy perspective where it can be demonstrated that a municipality has been discriminatorily applying and exercising cite and release procedures? Was one question. The next question was, I guess, what can be done from a policy perspective about cite and release? I forgot to say.
Well, there are a lot of lawyers, lots and lots of lawyers that like to get that type of data from you. They'll probably approach you after this meeting if you know that there's some racial disparities in doing site release. And there's a lot of lawyers that like getting to that and doing lawsuits. But I think, they like that. But, if you've got something, Mike, well, bring it to me and let's take a look at it.
Well, I mean, one of the things that that you can also go to the Department of Justice. You can always file a complaint with the Department of Justice. But one of the things that I've thought about looking into for legislation is the Police Oversight Commission. Doing a police oversight committee in certain circumstances for law enforcement. In my area in Fort Worth, we've had some issues come up with our law enforcement, and the community has requested that one be created. And Fort Worth has responded. The city of Fort Worth has responded, and they've created a community police oversight commission. And so I thought maybe that could be something that could be produced statewide. And so something like that, having a police oversight commission that would not be just law enforcement, but it would be, people from different areas that would, be experts in civilians also that can look at certain conduct from law enforcement.
One of the other bills the Senate did pass last time that ran out of time in the House was to say the police have to turn over exculpatory evidence to the prosecution. We talked yesterday about the Michael Morton Act. And so prosecutors under that, rightly, thankfully, have to share exculpatory evidence with the defense. But if they never get that exculpatory evidence from the police, then they don't have it to share. And it also brings to mind the grand jury reform, because one of the parts of that was to say the exculpatory evidence has to be shared with the grand jury. And ultimately, what all this kind of relates to is how far down the road are we going to have somebody get in the justice system before we have any exculpatory evidence? How long are they going to sit in jail and then they turn out not to be guilty of the crime? So I hope we can look at that next time.
Sure. I mean, we have renewed everything next year. I mean, you never.
Yeah,
know
we'll
what's gonna
see. We'll see. And I need to say this, I am talking with quite a few people about this law party scenario, and I know it's very, very horrible. I personally, I'm not pretty much there yet on any particular solution. I'm still listening because obviously, yes, the state of mind, right? And when you figure that out, and in this day and time, where you could have someone in New York, making bombs, and then taking it down to the Super Bowl in Miami and detonating the bombs like a terrorist operation, right? Obviously, there's some conspiracy there among folks. So, but what strikes me about this issue on law parties is when I listen to folks talk about their experience, in many instances, it involves something where maybe in the pretrial phase, something is being used as leverage that you were there and I will do this and you'll go down harder than even the guy that pulled the trigger. So those are probably practices or techniques that are used by, I guess, district attorneys. And, I don't know how much, other than elections and maybe some other situations, I don't know how much you can police that stuff
My
out.
understanding is there's not been a single death penalty case under law of the parties for at least a decade. It's just that, so no DAs in office now really pursue that. It's just there's people accumulated on death row when that was the practice. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah, she's
It's
like
rare though now,
death,
but still your point
she's
is
a
well
death
taken.
penalty expert.
Yeah,
She knows all
that's
of
all
it.
what I do.
And the problem is that there are people who, the trigger person can get less time than the person who doesn't take the plea deal. And that's an issue. It's like the person who says, I didn't pull the trigger, and they firmly believe they should not be the one that's doing the, put to death, or, and they don't take the plea deal, and they get more time, and the person who takes the plea deal, who actually pulled the trigger, they get out of jail.
Right. So there are a lot of other dynamics that are going on with this that needs to be looked at. But I'm here to say, in full disclosure, I'm not really settled on any particular.
I am.
Okay,
But because
but
it's
I'm not.
because it's mostly a problem of past cases, it's hard to pass retroactive bills. But this is one where whatever the solution is, it really probably should be retroactive.
Yes, absolutely.
This great lady.
Yes, I remember my second question now. My second question is, from a policy perspective, what can be done to address the varying approaches to dealing with marijuana cases across the state? For example, right now, among defense counsel, it's generally viewed as being marijuana is prosecuted in red counties, but not in blue counties. And from a personal perspective, I know that I've been in Houston myself and seen guys exchanging weed on the corner. But it's a different
Don't get
story.
caught up in law parties on that.
It's a different story in Caldwell than Hayes County. And I believe there should be some policy that you know what's happening across the state rather than just vary from place to place.
Again, that's something that we'll be looking at during the interim in the Criminal Jurisprudence Committee. That's what we've noticed, is that there's different policies and procedures in different municipalities and different counties. They're handling it differently. Some counties and municipalities have decided that they're going to just do business as usual and arrest individuals, and some have said that we're just going to do a cite and release. So that's something that we're going to look at in the hemp bill from this last session. I think it was HB 1325, has complicated things, and the fact that we were not able to pass Speaker Pro Tem Moody's bill that would have decriminalized possession of less than an ounce of marijuana has really complicated things. So we're going to look at that and then, again, take another look and see if we can do something at the state level.
An interesting story on that, by the way, this was many sessions ago, but there was a bill that we were supporting, which is still a great idea. It would have said after somebody's been successful, exemplary, on probation for 2/3 of their term, they could apply to have it reduced to a Class A misdemeanor with the consent of the prosecutor for a state jail felony. So this is possession of less than a gram of drugs, for example, that it was a positive incentive to be successful on probation, and by the way, to take probation to begin with, because you have a lot of people choosing state jail over probation. But in any case, there was a legislator who offered an amendment that said, I want to bracket this to the author's district. If this is such a good idea, let's try it there first. And I said, no, you have equal protection. You got to have the same criminal laws for the whole state. And sure enough, it went down on a point of order for that very reason. So I think your point is we do have to have some uniformity when it comes to what's a crime and how things are going to be handled, although obviously there's discretion in each case as well. And the cite and release does involve discretion. But if you don't live as long as you live in the county and there's not a reason to think that you're not going to appear, there's not an outstanding warrant, the real goal of it was to have police for, Class B misdemeanor marijuana to not take the person to jail and give them a ticket. And only some counties are actually even using it. And I know there was a bill a couple sessions ago to study how it's being used, and that didn't pass.
The old study bill, yeah.
Yeah. So,
Studies, they don't pass. But we want to look at also probation, technical revocations. It's in parole, it's pretty uniform. They have a model policy of how they are going to look at revocations. But when we're looking at probation, it's a hodgepodge. You know, every county is doing it differently. And so I want to see how we can, if it's even possible, to make it more uniform about revocations. You know, how are we handling revocations? And so that's another thing that I'm going to be looking at across the state as I go around and do these tours.
yeah, that's great. I mean, at the minimum, to have a matrix of graduated sanctions and incentives that every probation department, and we have 121, that they would use, and would definitely, I think, help us. It's about 12,000 technical revocations a year, which is several hundred million in prison costs. So, and again, these aren't new crimes. It's people, and not to belittle it, because you need to go to your probation meetings. You need to not leave the county without permission and all that. But we need to kind of have swift, certain, and commensurate responses rather than say, okay, you're going to go back to prison immediately for 10 years or whatever's left on your term. So,
Absolutely.
thank you for bringing that up. Do we have some other questions?
Thank you for being here. So my question is, what would you recommend that families of individuals who've been incarcerated and severely punished? My son was actually found guilty, law of parties. He decided to go to court and plead not guilty because someone pulled the trigger, someone was killed, and the shooter received 10 years. And my son, who was 19 years old, is serving life right now in TDCJ. We've gone through a couple of appeals, and of course, they're denied. And I'm trying to keep his hope alive, but yet my son is also having to fight for his life in prison while this other person is going to be released now in about 5 years.
Oh, my goodness. Well, don't give up. Do not give up. You know, always, you know, keep pursuing the justice. So you keep pursuing justice. He still has his appeals left.
I believe the person who's actually working on his appeals said that she had to pass him on because they could only work like twice.
Mm-hmm.
Went up to, I don't understand all of that,
Right.
but she said they were passing it on to someone else and they were actually
Okay.
giving him information on what was next.
Somebody came to talk to me about a second look act. I think there was a second look bill. You know, something like that would be helpful in your son's case to have somebody come back and look. But he wasn't a minor, though, at the time of his offense.
He was 18 at the time, and then he turned 19 in the process of being held in county.
I mean, you know, get with groups. You know, any type of nonprofit group. I think they want you to use a microphone. The nonprofit groups, you know, team up with them and see if there's any type of legislation. I mean, we don't pretend like we know everything. I mean, we get our ideas from people like you guys. You guys bring us ideas, and you guys are stakeholders. You got skin in the game. You come talk to us, and we're your voice. We're your mouthpiece on the floor, and we try to help, you know, promote your case. So, you know, get with other stakeholders who have, you know, ideas that share your plight, and then they can help you, you know, come up with some solutions that, you know, you can bring to us, and we can help you with that as well. So I don't have answers for you. I'm sorry, I don't. But I'm willing to sit with you and talk with you and meet with groups that can help you with that and talk with you about it.
Yeah, what is the county of conviction?
Dallas County.
Dallas County. Okay.
Yeah. But don't give up. That's one thing you can't do.
Well, and it's interesting because I think some DAs, there's a DA in Seattle, Dan Satterberg, who was elected as a Republican, interestingly, but he basically is going to the parole board and saying not just the people that they shouldn't release, but also the people that they should. And he's going back and looking at cases that were handled 30 or 40 years ago by his predecessor. And I mean, the law of the parties is a good example. We do look at some things a little differently now. Marijuana used to be a felony in Texas back in the day, and even people that don't think we should adopt reform now wouldn't say it should be a felony now. So societal attitudes change over time, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the better. But let's see, do we have any more questions or comments?
Let me weigh in on that,
Yeah.
Mark. You bring up a good point. And the House Committee on Corrections has oversight of the Board of Pardons and Paroles. And I think a lot of times the PPP really gets dropped into grease on this process. Now, I think it was HJR 19. You may know this better than I do. You tend to know all these little factoids better than I do. But I think it was HJR 19 back in the early 90s, late 80s, that pretty much the victim's rights. And it added victims' rights to the Constitution. So a victim is, we're required to notify a victim if there's any change in the sentence, any change in the case. So we have this scenario in Texas is that when someone is called for parole, up for parole, the sentencing court, the chief law enforcement officer in that county is called. The victim, and if the victim has passed away, then the victim's family, all those people get called up, okay, to include the district attorney's office. And these are the Board of Pardons Parole, they're made up of gubernatorial appointees. But let me just flip that, okay? If the victim's family is saying no, the victim is saying no, the DA's office is saying no, the law enforcement officer is saying no, the sentencing court is saying no, I mean, you see the situation if you are a governor's appointee. All these people are saying no after maybe there was a jury verdict, maybe there was a plea bargain, and then you just weigh in and say, well, regardless of all those people said no, and regardless of the jury verdict, I'm just going to say yes anyway. Now, they should be looking at this independently. They should be looking at the person's ability to reintegrate back into society positively. They're not really judging innocent or guilt or any problems that may have occurred during the trial. That's not really what they do. So you bring up the point I'm getting at, Mark. At some point, some of these other stakeholders, we're going to have to find a way to make sure that these stakeholders, they're reviewing the packet themselves, they're reviewing the rehabilitative measures themselves and making a decision. Okay, understand that a DA, the sentencing judge, the county sheriff, those are elected officials, and if they have victims saying no, for them to turn around and say, well, I know y'all saying no, but I'm going to say yes. And I'm an elected official. Usually when you say yes and people say no and vice versa, that's probably not the best way to get reelected, okay, if you do it across the board. So there are a lot of dynamics here, okay? And so we've got to make more thoughtful decisions. We have to understand that parole is not necessarily a certainty legally, right? You get a jury verdict or a plea bargain, okay, and we can talk about those too. So I just want to lay that out there. I get a lot of calls about the BPP in those scenarios, but I want to make sure people have it sort of in the context of what BPP does and what we can hold elected officials at elected time back home when they get these notices that someone is for parole. So if you want judges, county sheriffs, and DAs to look at these parole notices a little differently, we need to try to raise those issues up in an election environment and then hold them accountable.
Right, and clemency, I guess you can always apply for clemency.
That's
that's
another elected official.
Well, I'm just saying.
Right.
And, I've always thought about this, and I don't know what other states do. I mean, do the other states only rely on the governor for clemency? Do other states have all states just do governors? I don't know.
Yeah,
And the governor did just grant a clemency a few weeks ago to a victim of human trafficking. We'd like to see, obviously, quite a bit more of that. I mean, it's obviously the first step is identifying those individuals in prison who were victims of human trafficking. And even if, I mean, in some cases, they may not have been known at the time of trial, but in any case, if they were compelled in some way to commit that offense, and most of the women in our prison system are, in fact, it's drug possession or prostitution. Those are and property crimes, 90% nonviolent, and we really need to aggressively identify those cases. And but I also think, I mean, obviously, all of us would say, of course, victims and family members should have their voice heard in the parole process. But what we can also do, I think, is identify who can help this person when they come out and make sure the parole board knows that. Know that there's a minister that is committed to bringing them into their church. There's family members. Know what their situation is, because they're going to feel more confident about granting that person parole if there's a network of support around them.
And this is an election cycle, so I'm blessed not to have primary or general election opposition, and that's a good thing. They would have lost anyway. But here's the point. I do still spend a lot of time going to websites, reading stuff on social media. I still don't see very many candidates being asked, what's your position on parole? And not just us running for the legislature, but for governor, for sheriff, for district attorney. I don't see a lot of that out. Now they're asking me about these property taxes. And these school teachers ask me about these pay raises and this health insurance, okay? And they should still do that. But I still don't see the high level of activity in an election environment about these issues. And no one, I don't see any candidate really running, I see a few, but no candidate really running saying, I got to run to do this when I become judge, or I got to run to do this in criminal justice when I become sheriff. So hopefully this is 2020, so you can start this like today. When these people come to your foundations, they come to your chicken dinners, you'll be surprised when, people know checks are about to get written. You'll be surprised how their minds change, and you'll just be surprised, okay? So when they come around for this, maybe you should bring some of these issues up. Yes, Nicole and I want to work together on many of these issues, but in many instances, we still need the stakeholders back in your home communities doing some of these things too.
We got 2 minutes left, it looks like. Any final questions or comments here from the audience? We have a really good luncheon coming up, so I don't want to abridge that, but do y'all have any closing remarks?
Got to go home and talk about public ed. Got a big town hall tonight. Hey, thank y'all so much for your advocacy and your interest in the issue, and please make this a real strong 2020 election issue in your local races, not just for president or state rep, in your local races.
And I just would encourage businesses to get involved. Yes. I just want to make sure that the business industry understands that criminal justice impacts them as well. This is just not an area for education and social justice. This is a business issue as well.
Yeah, no, with the tight labor market, we've seen a huge surge of interest among employers in second chance hiring, so it's been one of the best developments the last few years. Thank y'all so much for being here. Thank our speakers.